Okay, so my first one worked. So I am super happy about that. So now we're going to go into the second one, which is going to give you even more information to help you. First off, we were ended the last one talking about consumerism. Now we're going to start to talk about the economic boom that's going to exist throughout the country during this time period. Again, reflecting back on what I said initially, because we were the nation that survived this war better than anybody else, we have the highest standard of living in the world in the 1950s. Americans are living better than everybody. About 60% of Americans were now in the middle class, which was higher than ever before in our history. Again, a lot of the federal policies that were put into place are going to help this. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act, otherwise known as the GI Bill, which again was put into place at the end of the war to help the soldiers transition back into life, into regular civilian life, was one of the big pushes for that. Because it gives $13.5 billion in federal funds to help these soldiers buy homes, which we're going to talk a lot about because that's the whole creation of a modern suburban society. And it also allows them to go to college, which again will transform our economy in a way that's unheard of, something that we've never done before in our history. In addition to that, during the war, Americans had saved lots of money because there was nothing to buy. So the women were going to work in the factories every day. The men were getting their salaries for fighting. But all that money was going into banks. So we had over $140 million banked in this country that we now wanted to spend. In addition to that, because the war itself was over, we were able to cut taxes by $6 million a year in 1945. So that meant people were paying less in taxes than they had been paying during the war. So they were even taking home more money. So our economy is just going to start to boom during this time period. Because of that, the workplace is going to start to change. And I always find this to be an interesting topic to talk about at a tech school. Because one of the things that you have to understand in those immediate years after World War II, so we're talking 47 to 57, 60-ish, the United States government intentionally tried to get rid of factory jobs in this country. Now, it's interesting because today our current administration and politicians and stuff always talk about let's bring the factory jobs back to America. Well, it was intentional that we got rid of those jobs. The reason we initially got rid of those jobs is because we wanted to turn into a white collar middle class society. The factory jobs, however, were blue collar jobs. They were the working class. We needed to move ourselves up to middle class. So we wanted to get rid of those factory jobs and encourage Americans to go to school, to get educated, become doctors, lawyers, teachers, policemen, firemen, all kinds of jobs like that. So between 47 and 57, we do decrease factory jobs by 4.3%, eliminating 1.5 million blue collar jobs. So you have that working class is either going to be forced into the white collar, meaning the middle class, or they're going to be pushed into the impoverished. By 1956, for the first time in our history, there's more white collar than blue collar jobs in America. And that is true today. Also, what happens here is you get the creation or the introduction of the modern day computer. The Mark I was introduced in 1944. The first IBM mainframe computer is introduced in 1951. Now, of course, at first, IBM mainframe computer was like a room-sized computer, nothing like we think of today. But what it does is it helps to start the transformation of American society into a more technologically based society. Again, the very, very, very beginning of that. And I'm not going to talk much about this, but I also want to mention that by 1960, 600 corporations, 0.5% of all U.S. companies, accounted for 53% of total corporate buildup or corporate income. Basically, what that means is, yes, 60% of Americans had become middle class, but the reality is that group of incredibly wealthy was still a tiny, tiny piece. And there were very few were still making most of the money. You know, today we always refer to it as the 10 percenters. Why does all this happen? Partially because of the Cold War buildup. This becomes the defense industries and stuff like that are making the most money. So, but again, I'm not going to talk a ton about the corporate stuff. Changes again, which I've mentioned this, but we're just going to review this here. Oops. Sorry. We're becoming more white collar, more clerical and professional. Again, doctors, lawyers, secretaries, things like that. Because of that, we're going to start to see a society of conformists, meaning we're going to start to focus on everybody needs to be the same. If you step outside of that ideal expectation, people are going to sort of push you out to the fringes of society. We wanted everybody to be the man in the gray flannel suit. And I'm going to talk more about the man in the gray flannel suit in a couple slides. But that idea of that everybody needs to be that guy, every man has to be that man that puts on the suit and goes to work every day. And every woman needs to be the housewife sitting at home, happily taking care of children and vacuuming and preparing dinner every day. So that's sort of what we're focusing, what we want people to be. Again, part of that is reflective of the fact that we went through 2 decades of unrest in this country. Between the Great Depression and World War II, there was so much stress, so much anxiety that this desire for normalcy, this desire for conformity is really what's going to bring us together in the 1950s. And again, the white collar is going to outnumber those who manufactured products, meaning it's going to outnumber the blue collar workers during this time period. Now, here's the man in the gray flannel suit. Sloan Wilson wrote a book in 1956 called The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit. It also became a movie. Basically, what this does is it highlights the idea that everybody was the same, that every American man was living, it seemed like, the same life. The idea that part of it was suburbia that created this, and I know we're still really haven't gotten into suburbia just yet, but also this expectation of conformity. You know, every man would get up in the morning, he would put on his gray flannel suit, he would drive his car to the train station, he would get on the train, he would take the train into the city, he would go into the office, he would do his work, he would take his 2 martini lunch every day, he would go back to work, then at the end of the day, he'd get on the train and he'd go back to his family in the suburbs where his wife would happily be waiting for him with dinner on the table. Again, it's an ideal, but it becomes almost a facade. This facade of everything is good when it's like this. But the reality is underneath that, there was a lot of smoldering unrest. Again, we talk about the racial unrest. We talk about unrest within women. And then we're going to get to the children too, because there actually is unrest amongst the youth. Hence the birth of rock and roll and things like that during this time period. So again, when we talk about unrest, we are talking about the other America. The fact that, yes, that's the way most white Americans were living, that man in the gray flannel suit. The reality is minorities and women had a very different life. It was not the ideal. The distribution of wealth was incredibly uneven, as it still is today. I don't think that's different or shocking to anybody at this point in time. The 42.5 million Americans, 1 in 4, were still considered poor. So yes, 60% of Americans were middle class, but you're still talking 25% were not middle class. So that pushes us up to 85%. And then there was that 15% that was was more upper class. So yeah, the wealth was not spread out equally. All right. So there was still a great deal of poverty. And again, the 1950s, as much as they're a time of good feelings and everything seems great, that unrest that's smoldering underneath the surface cannot be ignored because of the fact that you are dealing with 25% of the people are impoverished. Also, you're dealing with the fact that the minorities and women are going to sort of have to take a backseat to success in America throughout the decade. 1/2 of all African Americans and 1/2 of all Native Americans did live below the poverty line, which tells you that the wealth of the 1950s was not spread evenly. And that a lot of people actually were struggling, even though we tried to create this facade of happiness throughout this decade. All right, we're going to stop here, and then we start talking about the baby boom in suburbia in the next little lecture.